Greetings, class. In this installment, we're going to answer the question, what does winning in conflict look like? And so there's a number of different ways we can look at this. I want to provide all of them as different ways that you can use to evaluate the strategic success or the strategic failure in achieving different outcomes and your experiences with conflict. So, again, I've talked about a number of concepts in prior installments. One of the things that you've heard about that I'll remind you of is the three different satisfactions. That there's substantive, which is the material component in conflict, emotional, and so that's your feelings, and procedural, and so that's the process and who is included, how they're included. And so all of these satisfactions relate to our feelings about winning in conflict. If you get what you want, the substantive matter, the material component achieved, right? You have a conflict because your neighbor damaged your fence, and you approach them and you say, hey, look, there's a problem here. And they're like, what's the problem? And you say, yeah, your tree fell over and it damaged my fence. And so the problem, your need needs to be met. The fence needs to be repaired. You let them know. And now that conflict, you feel like you've won. You've prevailed. You've got your needs met. When the neighbor says, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that I heard a loud noise, but I hadn't checked. So let's go take a look. And they're like, yep, that sure was my tree. Or maybe it's not even the whole tree. Maybe just a branch fell down. But yeah, it sure did. It fell down and it has damaged your fence. And so how do you want to take care of this? Do you want me to call a repair person, or do you want to call a person and I'll just pay them? How do you want it to do like this to be happen? Right. That's a success, right? You get your need met. The person's happy to meet your needs, your interests are fulfilled. That's success, right? But that's substantive, right? Because the substantive concern will be resolved through an agreed upon outcome. Emotionally, you said like, hey, look, there's this thing going on. It's not the most pleasant thing in the world to tell somebody like, hey, we've got a problem. But the person was friendly. They received what you were saying well, right? So emotionally, you feel good about it. In fact, sometimes when you have a conflict with a neighbor and it gets resolved well, you feel even better afterwards because you're like, man, it's great living next to fantastic neighbors. They're good people, easy to work with. I'm glad they're here. Not all neighbors are so friendly. And then there's the process part, right? So, you voiced something, you were able to express your side, and then the neighbor responded. They were able to express their side. No agitation, no censorship, no bias, no legal confrontation. Like you can easily imagine where the neighbor's like, yeah, I think that's not my fault, and I guess you're just going to have to take me to court, right? And a legal process doesn't feel as good as just being able to, go through that. But again, you could feel satisfied in a legal process, as well as you might end up not feeling satisfied by a legal process. But so any of those satisfactions might feel like winning. All of those satisfactions met probably feels even more like winning. But winning in many cases is something it's complicated because in some settings, winning by default means that somebody's losing. And in other contexts, it doesn't feel like it's winning unless it's win-win. So I think we need to walk through kind of our understanding about what each of those means in terms of how we frame like our thinking about what the success of a conflict is. And that being said, we might also look at sometimes losing is winning, which is an interesting spin on things as well. But so if winning means I win and you lose, that means that we're framing our conflict or dispute as being zero sum, and that the more I achieve, the less you achieve, and vice versa. And so our interests are mutually incompatible or largely incompatible, and self-defeating. That the things I want are the things that you don't want, or vice versa, right? Maybe there's some variation on those themes, but in a negotiation, right, buyer and seller are trying to reach an agreement on a price. And so the buyer has done a really good job. Like every dollar that they take off the price tag feels like success. In a negotiation, every dollar that the seller reduces it feels like a loss. That's one way of framing it. In that same negotiation, we can employ strategies and concepts that we've already covered, like the BATNA and the WATNA. The BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and the WATNA is the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. Customer goes through the door, and they're interested to buy something. Part of the thing here is that if you don't sell to this buyer, that's a sale that's lost. So if there's room for maneuvering on what the price is, so the seller has in mind what they're shooting for, but they usually have in mind also what's the least that they'd be willing to accept. So if you'd be willing to let something go for, as long as you get at least $800 for it, which would be 80% of the $1,000 your asking price is. You could also frame your thinking about winning as everything that you get above the 800 that you were willing to accept is winning. So instead of looking at 875 as being losing $125, you see it as, hey, that's $75 more than the least I was willing to accept. That might also seem like a win, because the alternative to not selling it at 875 might mean that the person doesn't buy it at all, which means that the sale is lost. So, and then in terms of the buyer, it's kind of the opposite operation. A person has their ideal, this is how much they were looking to spend, and then they have like the most that they would be willing to spend. And frequently when people are shopping, they have budgets in mind. Like if somebody's buying, if it's not just a product, but like buying and selling a home, the budget would include like costs for repairs and so forth, where sometimes it's better to buy cheap and have lots of repairs that need to be made. Sometimes it's better for a person than if they buy high and there's no repairs that need to be made. It's really just a factor of like, what are the interests that are most important in some of these complex negotiations. In any case, where I'm going with this is that the win-lose, like I get the best deal and you get the worst deal, is probably the way most people frame their thinking about winning in conflict. But what I'd like to encourage people to think about is that finding win-wins actually maximizes the benefit for everyone. And so maximizing the benefit for everyone is actually a better win. And it also builds the relationship and increases the likelihood of being able to have future positive negotiations with an individual. That might not always be the case. Sometimes you're interacting with a stranger and there's really no reason to think that you would interact with them again. And so looking for a win-win in those cases might not be as advantageous. But looking for win-wins is usually a faster pathway towards resolution, if that is important, right? Time is also another factor that can be important in these contexts. Which gets us to the last part where I was going to put the interesting spin on it, where sometimes losing in conflict is actually winning, right? So how do I turn a loss into a victory? So one of the ways you turn a loss into a victory is that you didn't get the agreement that you wanted, but you get the outcome that you desired. And sometimes this means actually telling a buyer no. They say like, this is the most I can sell this for or pay for this. And then you just, that's all there is to it. Like, no, that's not enough and no deal. And by not having a one negotiation, right? By not reaching an agreement, you actually defend or protect the underlying interest, which is that you're safeguarding for reaching, a positive outcome. So selling something for less than you think it's worth, right, means that you miss out on the person who might come in the next day and pay full price for it, right? So it's a loss in the short term, but it's a win in the long term. That's some part of the mechanism of what I'm trying to describe here, is that sometimes not reaching an agreement is okay. Sometimes people's BATNAs and WATNAs end up being incompatible. Like the highest I'm willing to pay for something is less than the least you're willing to accept. No harm, no foul. Like you try to reach an agreement, and it might take some effort, but at the end of the day, not all conflicts are going to be negotiated agreements. But another way that this plays out is that sometimes, what happens when you lose in a conflict, you give in to the needs or the wants of the other party. It has other positive benefits. And sometimes that is, we didn't want X, Y, or Z to happen, but sometimes confronted with the information, it turns out that we've been wrong and that the X, Y, or Z is actually right. Lots of times people have bad ideas about what costs or values or expenses will be, So you go over to the neighbor, like I started with, and you say, we've got a problem. During the windstorm yesterday, one of your branches or one of your trees came down and it damaged the fence. And the person says, oh, all right, well, here's $500, to take care of it. And you're like, I appreciate your willingness to get this handled. I don't actually think that $500 is going to repair it. And the person's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I thought that was way more than enough. Well, so you could be wrong. You could end up saying, well, let's just go to the store and get the materials. And then you're just like, well, neighbor, I have to tell you, my idea about the cost of lumber was completely wrong. You sure were right, and so you're wrong. But the alternative could also be the case as well, that the person goes to this store with you to buy the replacement parts and they're like, I didn't realize that your cedar was actually that much more expensive than, other lumber, right? And then they're like, yeah, of course. I mean, we're going to get this repaired. We're going to get this replaced, But yeah, so sometimes people have agreements in substance about, yes, I need to get those repairs made or cover the costs of those repairs. But then they have disagreements about the substance of the terms of what that actually means or what the cost of that will be. And so if you give in, which is you end up spending more than what you thought it was, you still might feel like you've done the right thing, right? Like by accepting that you were wrong on the position you held, which sometimes feels like a loss. We can have positive outcomes, right? So there's a lot of just different ways to look at it. Just because you started with a certain position doesn't mean that you have to stick to that position. I think one of the things that happens a lot as people get into their conflicts is that they dig in. And the more they fight, the more they're locked into their positions. But part of what happens is sometimes you get dug in and then you realize, actually, I'm wrong here. And the faster we can pull ourselves out of heated debates or disagreements and disputes, especially when there's costs associated with it, the faster we are able to rectify our situation from having defended a position that we now find to be indefensible, right? The quicker that we can pivot from, I actually was wrong, right? Sometimes that's the victory, is that you minimize the losses, you minimize the damages, you reconcile whatever relationships and mechanisms there were that were beneficial to you, and instead of going nuclear on a conflict. Some people will fight to the very bitter end on disputes, even when they've known for maybe even years that what they were defending is something that they were wrong about. I simply don't know how else to say it. I know people that it's easier for them to argue a point that they don't believe than it is to admit they were wrong. And so there's different ways to win. Sometimes winning is by being honest. Sometimes winning is by being able to get what you want. And sometimes winning is reaching, the win-win where everybody's needs get met and everybody's happy. So figure out what assessment you need. Figure out what it means to have delivered the outcome you were desiring. Don't let what feels like this other person's happy turn into, a feeling like if they're happy, that means that they didn't lose. If they didn't lose, that means I didn't win. In some contexts, that's exactly the case. You didn't win because they didn't lose. But in other contexts, you won even bigger if both people are happy with the agreement. Anyway, see you on the next one.